Hello, my name is Rob DeLeon. I'm the Associate Vice President of Programs at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at TheFortuneSOC. Today's show is titled The Ticking Clock to Criminalization. New York was previously one of only 2 states that automatically prosecuted 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. In 2017, the Raise the Age initiative was passed by the New York legislature and signed by Governor Cuomo. This legislation represents a major shift in the approach our legal system uses to address 16 and 17-year-olds accused of crimes. Under the new law, the majority of these cases should be diverted directly to family court or for young people remaining in the adult system. For example, because they are accused of violent felonies, to judges within that system that have access to social services and special training. On October 1st, 2018, the first phase of the Raise the Age law took effect in New York State, as the state is no longer supposed to automatically charge all 16-year-olds as adults. In October 2019, the law phases in for 17-year-olds as adults. I'm honored to have 2 guests here with me today who are both extremely knowledgeable about the age of responsibility issues as they work to assist young people involved in the legal systems. Anne-Marie Louison is the Chief Strategic Initiatives Officer at the Center for Alternative Sentencing and Employment Services, CASES. She joined CASES in 1999, where she co-founded the Nathaniel Project, the first alternative to incarceration program in Manhattan Supreme Court for adults with severe and persistent mental illness convicted of felony offenses. The project was licensed in 2003 to provide evidence-based assertive community treatment, or ACT, services. She's also a consultant to the Council of State Governments, the Justice Center, and is regularly selected to attend national expert panel discussions on jail diversion. Prior to joining CASES, Anne-Marie was a social worker for the Manhattan Psychiatric Center on Rikers Island and a probation officer in England. Nancy Ginsburg is the director of the Adolescent Intervention and Diversion Project in the criminal practice of the Legal Aid Society. She's been with the Legal Aid Society for over 20 years as an attorney in the juvenile rights and criminal practices. Nancy has represented thousands of children and adolescents in criminal, juvenile delinquency, child protective, foster care, and educational administrative proceedings. She's responsible for supervising and training lawyers in the area of adolescent practice and educational advocacy for the Legal Aid Society. Nancy is responsible for legislative and policy issues concerning court-involved adolescents in the adult criminal court system. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So again, thank you guys for being here today. I'm just going to refer to my notes as I have some questions that I think will serve, they'll make for an interesting discussion. So increasing the age of criminal responsibility to 18. One question that I think is important to ask is 18 old enough? Do we think that, it's an age where these young people are or should be charged as adults for the actions that they take within that age range? Vermont, for instance, has raised the age to 21. And states like Massachusetts and Connecticut are also looking to do the same. And so based on everything we know, including about brain development, what do you think is the most appropriate age for a person to be held accountable for these kinds of actions, Anne-Marie?
So I think one of the things that we know, and Nancy will be a testament to this with the young people that she represents and the families that she interacts with sort of every day, and sort of your experience as well, Rob, at the Fortune Society, is the notion that adolescence is a real developmental period of time. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the mark, But if we sort of reflect on our personal experience of adolescence, I think we would concur, with what scientists are telling us. So they are sort of telling us the brain continues to develop well past the age of 18. They are sort of telling us also that there are many sort of complex interactions that happen during adolescence that we just know. I remember when I was 18 a long time ago, but if we sort of reflect on that and think about the individuals that are involved in our justice system, we know that they're more impulsive. We know that the sort of ability to sort of execute decision making is really compromised when you're an adolescent, that you don't have all of that sort of cognitive sort of capacity that comes with being able to think about consequences, being able to think about future life sort of decisions. We know that adolescents are also susceptible, to peer pressure. And that means something when we think about the young people that we interact with in the New York City criminal justice system, particularly I think both in terms of development sort of the brain, but also I think the notion of success being at risk of peer pressure is sort of for some of those young people related to both their survival in their communities and could have really dire consequences for them. And one of the, I think, sort of other aspects that we know about the brain, and clearly there's a legal argument that Nancy will provide around brain development and culpability and age and the notion of adult responsibility. But one of the other areas that we know, particularly for people living in communities of color who are far more exposed to the criminal justice system in every community in the United States, but particularly in our communities in New York City, is the notion of what trauma does to the brain. And we have seen that, again, neuroscientists, psychologists and other scientists are proving that sort of traumatic experiences have a completely important impact on how the brain develops. And that then has sort of ongoing sort of consequences for young people. So one of the things I would just reconfirm is adolescence is a particular period of time. And I want to sort of hand over to Nancy of the notion of adolescence, brain, culpability, 18, 21, 16,
right.
In your experience.
And Nancy, you've worked with, youth as young as 13, right, to 15 and all the way through to the 18-year-olds. So do you think we've established the appropriate age of criminal responsibility?
Well, I think the science shows, both the neuroscience and the social science demonstrates that the brain develops until 24. And so there is, I think, a vibrant conversation going on about whether or not 18 is the appropriate age. And there are a few states that are going above 18. I think in New York, it was a little bit complicated since we had been a 16 since the 1800s state.
Right.
And so just raising it to 18 was a huge change for this state. I think that once the age is eventually up to 18, there might be an appetite, hopefully there will be an appetite to reassess as to whether or not we can raise the age higher and what that should look like. I think there's a lot of discussion as, is it appropriate to have 18 to 21 or 18 to 24-year-olds in the juvenile court system or in the criminal court system with different rules, perhaps with shorter sentences, with different types of services available to that age group to make it more developmentally appropriate for that age group. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for making the system age appropriate for adolescents and young adults. And so hopefully once we get through the 17-year-old phase-in year, we will have opportunity to really look at that 18 to 24-year-old cohort.
Right. So something interesting that I learned was that at the same time that we were considering the age of criminal responsibility around 2017, Japan was. And this is something that goes back to the 1800s as well. In Japan, they were kind of grappling with the ideas of these different things that kind of mark ages of responsibility for these different things, such as smoking, such as getting married or purchasing alcohol or getting licensed and these kinds of things. And so my question is, and I guess to you, Nancy, what are your thoughts around that? Should there be some uniformity amongst those things? For instance, you can enlist in the Army at 18. You can't buy alcohol at 21. Until just last year, we were charging 16-year-olds as adults. And, do you have any thoughts around the uniformity of those things?
Well, we always used to say in New York that the only place you were an adult at 16 was in criminal court. So yes, we believe that there should be uniformity. The adolescent brain is the adolescent brain, regardless of what building they're standing in or what system they're moving through. And I think, you can't rent a car until you're 25. And
Right.
the interesting thing
Right.
about that is the insurance companies actually paid for all of that brain science. That's where the brain science started. The insurance companies were particularly concerned about renting cars to young adults under the age of 25 because there are more accidents, because they are more impulsive, because they are more likely. There are actually studies that show that young people are more likely to get into car accidents when they're in cars with other people, which goes to the peer pressure argument. So I think it's clear that as different ages are raised for different purposes, that we really should be looking globally for an age where we can say young adults are actually
Right.
adults.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess to you, Anne-Marie, if you could talk a little bit about, this thought of uniformity, but maybe even add a bit of whether or not mental health needs play a role.
So I think I sort of wholeheartedly agree with what Nancy has described in terms of uniformity. I think sort of culturally for me, as someone from England, I was quite shocked when I sort of came to the States in terms of all of the different sort of age limits and the sort of distribution, the lack of uniformity in some of the sort of decision making or things that young people in the United States could do. And so some of that's to do with the United States and history around alcohol, which is an interesting one.
Right.
But to the point around uniformity, I think it's important to be consistent. And I think that, as Nancy has reiterated, there is something about sort of adolescence that's particular to adolescence. And the point about the sort of renting of the car and the accidents is really critical, because one of the things that research also shows is that the distance and the difference between sort of childhood mortality and adolescent mortality is there's a 200% increase in adolescence. And it goes to all the things we've already talked about: impulsivity. So young people are dying car accidents, they're dying sort of eating disorders, they're dying as a result of suicide and depression and homicide. So there's something very particular about the sort of experience of young people. And so we would want to ensure that there are, again, I'm not a lawyer, but the notion of, like protections for a group of people, like adolescents, to me as a layperson who's not an attorney, would suggest that there is a need for protections for the group. Like there are particular things that are happening in that age that we need to protect the young people against, both in terms of how we respond to them if they're impulsive and are sort of policed because they live in a particular area and then become involved in the criminal justice system, as well as don't go rent a car that you're going to be in an accident for. And so I think this is sort of really a critical thing around thinking about uniformity in every sphere of life. I was interested in something just quite not connected to this around criminal justice, but the notion of who could get married in New York State until sort of recently. And so advocates had to really sort of protect young girls who were being married at very early ages, sort of in our own state here in New York, which is sort of very fascinating to me. So I think uniformity matters, yeah.
Right. So recently all 16-year-olds were moved off of Rikers Island and into a new setting, into a new building. They're still, in detention and in an incarcerative setting, but the New York City Administration for Children's Services for whatever reasons, wasn't prepared to staff this change, right? And as a result, the mayor authorized or gave the directive that Rikers Island guards would be the staff at this new facility for the 16-year-olds coming off of Rikers Island. And there were some bad outcomes, right? There was some violence. There was some not so great outcomes at the beginning. To date, there are still some struggles with the rollout of this new setting for the 16-year-olds. The 17-year-olds will be joining that setting. So Nancy, what role do you think, if any at all, moving the Rikers Island guards to the new setting played in, I guess, the poor rollout, for lack of a better way of describing it?
So there was a decision made as part of the legislation to move both the 16 and 17-year-olds in New York City into Horizon, which is the facility, and that was made primarily, we believe, based on the history of Rikers and the history of violence on the island. I think that it was confusing for a lot of people, I think both for the kids and the adults who moved into that building, as to what that was going to look like, because you took corrections officers who had a history of working in an adult setting, even though they were working with kids, and they were now being asked to act like juvenile officers
or counselors
without the actual training to do so or the supports to do so, and so it was hard to imagine that was going to go exactly the way everyone wanted it to go. As far as the violence, it was actually a very short spike, just for the first few weeks after that transition. And I think once everyone kind of developed an understanding that this was really going to happen, and they had to, both the corrections officers had to make adjustments and the kids had to make the adjustments. I think, there was some confusion on the part of the kids. They really felt like, we're getting off Rikers. Why are we here with corrections officers?
Right.
And so that was disappointing for some of them. And because they are teenagers, they acted in ways that you would expect teenagers to express frustration. And I think that once things settled down and everyone understood that they were there and this was their new environment, things became much better. Obviously, we would really like to see the building fully staffed with fully trained counselors who understand adolescent development and want to work with adolescents and are hired to work with adolescents, and don't bring a culture from a correctional facility that has a history of violence. So we are looking forward to the transition to all juvenile counselors in that facility. But I will give them credit for doing better since the facility opened.
So well put, Nancy. And Anne-Marie, as we move closer to closing Rikers Island and towards, community-based jails, what do you think a community-based jail setting, detention setting for young people should look like? So
I think one of the first and important things is that for young people, we should ensure that the resources are in the community, that the young people who end up detained are a very small sample of the population that might be involved in the system. And so I think that that should be our first and most important goal, that it should be a very tiny group of people. And so as someone who came from the UK, and I worked as a probation officer in the UK a very long time ago, but I used to go into I had clients that when I was a probation officer were in the youthful offenders institution, and it was a separate institution for young people up to the age of 21 actually. So already we sort of see a difference. And to Nancy's point, and there were issues there. I'm not disputing that there were issues. It's a jail. It's a detetion center even for young people. So I'm not sort of going to romanticize that it was necessarily a good facility. But one of the things that has stuck in my mind as I thought about like going to Rikers and other facilities is that each area was like a home. There was a living room, there was a kitchen. I think most importantly, the staff that worked there elected to work there and were trained to work there. Were trained to work with this small group of young people. And the response in the community responded to the fact that young people were making a transition out of detention. And so it didn't matter what you went into the detention center for. Social workers, probation officers were social workers. And so our job back then, many years ago, many decades ago that I've been in the UK, was to really help that young person make the transition back into the community in a helpful, supportive way that involved the family and that young person. It wasn't just about supervision. It was really about, this is not normal. You have been in an institution. You've been in a jail and you're a young person. So it didn't matter if you were in that facility for 2 days, if you were in there for 3 months or 6 months, that you were supported by a social worker who had the title of probation officer to help you make that transition. So it was responsive to the notion that they were young people. We were also responsible for going and visiting those young people. And so if they were in there, you were supposed to go visit them weekly to see how they were doing, because just the trauma. And so early on, Rob, you had mentioned mental health, and I hadn't answered your question. And so I think that one of the areas related to mental health is just trauma. I think being in an institution is traumatic. And so we have responses for young people in the mental health field, young people that experience first episode psychosis. There's a response to that is really sort of intensive to stop the process that someone may develop full psychosis, as an adult, and that's going to be their life trajectory. I think there are ways, we know the science, we know the interventions, we know good services and treatment that we can really think about for the young people that go in. What does that response look like, regardless of who they are, regardless of crime? It shouldn't be related to crime and resources. It should be related to, it's abnormal for anybody, but particularly young people, to being in an institution.
Right. And do you think that New York State has taken any steps or should be taking steps to address that issue of first episodes of psychosis? Has there been any kind of innovation around that you can speak to at all?
Definitely within the mental health system, but I think it's an important question for Nancy, who sees these young people. I think what I was describing is this notion of being incarcerated is traumatic and should have some healthy, particular response. We shouldn't just take it for granted that young people come out, in and out, or have that sort of experience. And so I think that this is an area where we could be much more deliberate in thinking about what does it mean, just the experience of being incarcerated. So I'm not even talking about when you've been assessed to have a mental health need or a substance abuse. I'm just talking about like that experience. What is our sort of response to young people that have been detained and incarcerated? What does that sort of look like just generally sort of across the spectrum for young people? I'd be interested in Nancy's response to the question.
Well, I think, you have to look at it kind of globally. So you need to look at how long we're keeping kids in. There's science that shows that kids generally naturally desist from offending. So should they be exposed to adult sentences? Should there be a shorter sentencing structure for them? When they're in, are we providing services to their families or to the adults who are going to take them back into the community? Do we spend resources in stabilizing their caretakers or the important people in their lives so that when they come out, they're released into a healthy situation? That is not really an area where generally we have looked at, where we have dedicated resources to. And what kind of services do kids get when they're in, right? In New York City, we dedicate a lot of resources. Now we have a very strong mental health system for those kids. Historically, we have not. In many other jurisdictions around the state, that does not exist. So if you have any type of mental illness from low level to serious, it is unlikely you're going to get any treatment or meaningful treatment when you're in detention or you're incarcerated. And so you come out to what? There's no real planning that goes on. There's no real planning for when you're in and as you re-enter the community.
So, I mean, this is all really great stuff, and I feel like we may take the discussion off the air. But any closing thoughts from either of you?
I think in closing, I would say, and thank you so much, both of you. It's been good to have this discussion together. I've really enjoyed it. I think there is a moment that we have in New York State and in New York City, and maybe in particular, and it's an opportunity to think about new ways of doing the work, new services and new interventions. Even though New York is very service rich, I still feel there's something that's very particular to our response. So we just think about sort of young people of color, and the particular interventions, culturally competent interventions that work, like thinking about families of color and what they need, thinking about the environments in which young people are sort of going back to, and thinking about their development in the context of living in a racist society. It's very critical. It's not just adolescent development in general, it's adolescent development for these particular young people of color, which I think is just sort of critical as we think about and imagine what could be, with the notion that for adolescents, less detention is best.
Yeah, I mean, we would really like to see Raise the Age be the starting point in a larger discussion about how to make a developmentally appropriate system for adolescents and young adults, so that we're looking at everything, services while they're incarcerated, services in the community, services to the family, prevention so that they don't ever have to enter the system, education, vocational, all aspects of it.
Well, this has been a thought-provoking discussion. Thank you both. Thank you to the viewers tuning in. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Rob DeLeon, and I appreciate you joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars. Thank you.